Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It seems like every time we turn around, there's another headline about electricity. Electric cars, energy shortages, those crazy price swings. It's a lot to keep up with.
It really is, and that's exactly why we're here today. To dive deep, no pun intended, into the International Energy Agency's Electricity 2025 report. It's like their yearly checkup on the state of electricity around the world, and it's packed with insights.
So for our listeners who maybe haven't had a chance to read the full report, what exactly is the IEA, and what's the scope of this Electricity 2025 report?
Well, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is like a think tank, but a really, really important think tank focused on energy. I mean, governments around the world rely on them for data, analysis, the whole picture. And this Electricity 2025 report, it's their deep dive into the global electricity sector. They look at everything from how much electricity we're using to where it's coming from to where things are headed over the next few years, globally and in key regions. This is actually the sixth year they've put out this report. And this year, they've got a special spotlight on China and this interesting phenomenon of negative wholesale electricity prices.
Negative prices. Now, that's something I definitely want to unpack later, but first, let's set the stage for our listeners. I'm imagining someone who's interested in the future of electricity, but maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all the information out there.
Absolutely. We all are. There are so many reports, so many articles. It's tough to sift through it all. So think of this deep dive as your shortcut. We've done the heavy lifting, read the report, and we're pulling out the key insights so you don't have to.
Perfect. So today we're on a mission to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from this Electricity 2025 report.
You got it. We'll cover how much more electricity the world is going to need. Think electric cars, air conditioning, the whole shebang. The challenges to keeping the lights on reliability is a big one. The strange world of electricity pricing, including those negative prices, and how different parts of the world are changing their power generation mix. Coal, renewables, the whole energy mix.
And what kind of information are we drawing on from the IEA's report?
Well, it's a mix. They've got some in-depth analysis of recent trends in electricity, their forecasts of what they expect to happen over the next few years, and some great discussion of recent government policies, things that are shaping the electricity sector. So we'll try to weave all that together to paint a clear picture for our listeners.
Sounds good. So let's start with the basics. When it comes to electricity demand, what's the global picture looking like? Are we talking growth, decline, stability?
Well, based on the IEA's projections, we're looking at pretty solid growth in global electricity demand. All the way through to 2027, they're forecasting an upward trend. So more demand, more electricity needed.
So more demand, that means more strain on our systems, more need for power plants, more everything. But where is this demand coming from? Which countries or regions are really driving this increase?
That's a great question. And one of the big takeaways from the report is the role of India. It's incredible they're projected to account for about 10% of the total global increase in electricity demand between now and 2027. Think about that 10%.
Wow, it's a huge chunk. What's fueling this surge in India's electricity needs?
Two big things. One is their strong economic growth. When economies grow, businesses expand, people have more money to spend, and that all translates into more demand for electricity. And the second is the rapidly increasing use of air conditioning. As India gets wealthier and temperatures rise, more and more people are buying air conditioners, and that's a big energy suck.
Makes sense. And the report actually delves deeper into India's electricity use, right?
Yeah, they do. They actually have this really interesting analysis of India's peak load trends, that time of day when electricity demand is at its highest. And they look at how these time of use tariffs are playing a role. Basically, that means charging different prices for electricity depending on what time of day it is. So if you use electricity during peak hours, you pay more.
So they're trying to incentivize people to shift their electricity use away from those peak times when the grid is already under stress. Smart. But what about the more developed economies, places like the US, Europe, Japan? How are they contributing to this global demand growth?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a bit of a different story in those places. You're right that in 2024, the total electricity demand in advanced economies was pretty much flat compared to 2021. Most of the growth we saw during that time was coming from emerging markets. But here's the thing. The IEA forecasts that this will shift.
Oh, really? So how are things expected to change?
They're saying that between now and 2027, advanced economies will likely make up around 15% of the additional electricity demand. And this is being driven by a couple of things. First, we've got the electrification of transportation and heating, More people are switching to electric vehicles and using things like heat pumps, which run on electricity instead of natural gas.
Yeah, that's something we're seeing more and more of. Even I'm thinking about getting an electric car.
Exactly. And then the second thing driving this demand growth is the expansion of data centers, those massive server farms that power the internet, cloud computing, all that digital stuff. They're incredibly energy hungry.
Data centers, out of sight, out of mind, but definitely not out of the energy equation.
Hmm.
So in the U.S., is that primarily what's driving this anticipated increase in demand? The data centers.
Pretty much, yeah. The growth of data centers is definitely a key factor in U.S. electricity demand trends. But in the European Union, it's a bit more complicated. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the recovery of their energy-intensive industries, like, steel, chemicals, those kind of heavy industries. And how those industries bounce back will have a big impact on how much electricity they'll need.
So it's not a uniform story across the developed world. Some interesting regional variations there. But looking back historically, what's generally been the relationship between a country's electricity use and how well its economy is doing?
Well, historically, there's been a really strong link between how much electricity a country uses and its economic growth, measured by GDP,
Yeah.
especially in those emerging economies. I mean, it makes sense. When economies are growing, you have more factories running, more businesses operating, more people buying stuff, and all of that requires more electricity.
Right, it's like a chicken-egg situation.
Yeah.
A growing economy needs more electricity, but having access to reliable electricity also helps economies grow. It's a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. So it's interesting to see how this relationship will evolve as we shift towards cleaner sources of electricity and as the digital economy continues to expand.
Absolutely. So if we zoom in and look at the breakdown of electricity demand by sector, where is most of this additional demand coming from? Is it households, industry, something else?
Well, if you look ahead to the period between 2025 and 2027, the IEA projects that the industrial sector will be the biggest driver of demand growth. They're estimating that industry, excluding things related to new energy products like hydrogen, will account for roughly half of the total increase in electricity demand. So, your classic manufacturing and industrial activities are still a huge factor.
Now, I know we've talked about China's booming electric vehicle market, but the report also highlights their ambitious goals for reducing carbon emissions. How's that impacting their electricity demand, particularly within their massive industrial sector?
China's dual carbon goals are a big deal. They're aiming to peak their carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and then achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And to do that, they're really pushing industries to switch from burning fossil fuels directly to using electricity. It's called electrification. And one of the key trends they're seeing is the increasing use of robots in manufacturing.
Oh, interesting. Robots. So they're replacing human workers with robots that run on electricity.
In a way, yes. The report mentions that the number of industrial robots in China has basically doubled since 2020. There are about 2 million of them in operation in 2024, and they're estimating that this increase in automation alone could be responsible for an extra 15 terawatt hours of electricity demand between 2021 and 2024.
15 terawatt hours. Wow, that's a huge amount of energy. Can you put that into perspective for us?
A terawatt hour is a massive unit of energy. To give you an idea, it's roughly equivalent to the annual electricity consumption of millions of homes.
Yeah.
So yeah, those robots are definitely using a lot of power.
So industrial growth, a shift towards electric vehicles, and greater demand for cooling. What about China's massive investments in the digital economy? Are their data centers having a significant impact on their electricity demand?
China's really going all in on building up its digital infrastructure. They've got this strategy called Eastern Data and Western Computing. It involves, well, basically distributing their computing operations across different regions. So they're using renewable energy in the less populated West and North for things like training AI models and storing massive amounts of data, while focusing on faster connections in the East and Central regions for services that need really quick response times. And they've poured something like $6 billion into these national computing data center projects. It's quite impressive.
So more servers, more data crunching, that's got to mean a lot more electricity, right?
Well, not necessarily. The IEA emphasizes that simply having more computing power doesn't automatically translate into a proportional increase in electricity consumption. And that's because China is really prioritizing energy efficiency in these new data centers.
Oh, right. They're not just building more data centers, they're building them to be more energy efficient. Can you tell us a little bit more about their efficiency goals?
Yeah, they've set some pretty ambitious targets. For example, they want to reduce the average power usage effectiveness, or PUE, of their data centers to below 1.5. PUE is a measure of how much energy a data center uses for actual computing versus all the other stuff like cooling and lighting. A lower PUE means they're using energy more efficiently. They're also working to improve things like water usage and carbon emissions from these data centers. And importantly, they have these goals to significantly increase the use of clean energy to power those data centers.
So they're trying to build a greener digital economy, which is encouraging to hear. Now let's shift our focus back to India for a moment. You mentioned earlier that their peak load is a concern. Can you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so peak load refers to the highest amount of electricity demand that a power system experiences at any given moment. And India has seen really strong growth in its peak load in recent years. To try and manage this, the government is implementing something called time of use tariffs.
Time of use tariffs, that rings a bell. Can you remind us how that works?
Basically, it means that the price you pay for electricity changes depending on what time of day you're using it. So during those peak hours, when everyone's turning on their lights and appliances, the price of electricity goes up. And the idea is to incentivize people to shift their energy use to other times of the day when demand is lower.
Makes sense. So is it working? Are they able to manage their peak demand with these time of use tariffs?
Well, it's helping, but even with those measures, there are concerns about potential electricity shortages in the future. One recent estimate suggested that India could face a shortfall of between 20 and 40 gigawatts during those peak evening hours by 2027, even if all of their planned power plants come online as scheduled.
20 to 40 gigawatts. Wow, that's a huge amount of power. To put it in context, 1 gigawatt is enough to power a city of about 1 million people. So they're potentially facing a situation where millions of people could be without power during those peak times. How did they manage to meet demand in 2024? Did they avoid any major blackouts?
They did, but it took some pretty aggressive measures. The Central Electricity Authority, which manages the grid, had to take steps like ensuring that power plants using imported coal and natural gas kept running, minimizing any planned maintenance outages, and working really hard to reduce any unplanned outages. These efforts really helped to boost the amount of electricity available, and they were able to meet that peak demand of 250 gigawatts on May 30th, 2024.
So they squeaked by, but it sounds like managing peak demand will continue to be a major challenge for India in the years to come. Now let's hop over to the United States. We talked about heating and transportation becoming more electric as factors driving demand.
Yeah.
What's the latest there?
You're right, those are big trends. On the heating front, the shift towards electrification, more people using heat pumps, it did slow down a little bit between late 2022 and early 2024. But overall growth is still expected. And heat pumps are becoming increasingly popular. In fact, in 2023, for the first time ever, heat pumps actually outsold traditional gas furnaces for home heating in the U.S.
Wow, that's a pretty significant tipping point. So electric heating is definitely gaining ground. What about electric vehicles? They've been all over the news. It seems like everyone's buying a Tesla these days.
You're not wrong. The electric vehicle market in the U.S. has been growing really fast. Their market share went from just 2% in 2019 to 10% in 2024, but the rate of growth did ease up a bit in 2024 compared to 2023, even though the total number of electric vehicles sold was still going up. And just to be clear, we're talking about all types of plug-in electric vehicles here, so that includes both fully electric vehicles, the BEVs, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, the PHEVs, which can run on both electricity and gasoline.
So continued growth, just not quite as explosive as before. Now, something that caught my eye in the IEA report was the prediction of a pretty big jump in electricity demand in some specific regions of the U.S., particularly in the West and in Texas. What's driving that projected surge?
You're talking about those big upward revisions we've seen in the forecasts? Yeah, for the Western Interconnection, that's the electric grid that covers most of the Western states, they're now projecting that demand will grow twice as much over the next decade compared to what they were saying just a couple of years ago. And a lot of that has to do with the expected development of large industrial and commercial facilities.
In Texas, I'm guessing the situation there is pretty unique, right?
It is. Texas has its own grid, managed by the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCUTS, and they're predicting some truly massive growth in electricity demand. In their July 2024 forecast update, they said they expect summer peak demand to skyrocket from about 85 gigawatts in 2023 to a whopping 141 gigawatts in 2029.
Wow, that's an enormous increase. What's behind that? Is it all just air conditioning because, Texas summers.
Air conditioning is definitely a factor, but it's not the whole story. They're seeing this growth across a bunch of different areas. Data centers, those energy hogs we talked about earlier, are expanding rapidly. Cryptocurrency mining, which is incredibly energy intensive, is also growing there. And then you've got industries electrifying their operations, especially in the oil and gas sector. Plus, there's the whole push towards a hydrogen economy and, of course, all those electric vehicles hitting the roads.
Cryptocurrency mining, huh? So even Bitcoin is impacting the grid now. This is getting complicated. But looking at the bigger picture, is this trend of increasing demand in Texas and the West reflected in national forecasts for the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, they're responsible for overseeing the reliability of the bulk power system in North America. They're projecting that electricity consumption in the U.S. will grow at an average annual rate of about 1.7% between 2024 and 2034. And they're specifically pointing out that these projected increases in peak demand, both in the summer and winter, are actually reversing a long-standing trend of flat or even declining growth in electricity use.
So the U.S. is about to see a major upswing in electricity demand after a pretty long period of relative stability. Fascinating. And what about the European Union? Earlier, you mentioned some uncertainties in their outlook. How are things shaping up there in terms of electricity demand?
The EU is an interesting case. In 2024, their electricity demand was actually shaped by a combination of weather and the overall economic situation. Because many parts of Europe had a milder winter heating season, their demand for heating went down by about 8 terawatt hours, according to the IEA's estimates. France was a bit of an exception. They actually had a slightly colder winter. But on the flip side, they used a lot less energy for cooling in the summer because they didn't have as many hot days.
So weather is definitely playing a role. But you said the economic situation was also a factor.
Yeah, the overall economic outlook for the EU isn't as rosy as it once was. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has lowered their GDP growth projections for the region, and that's leading to some downward revisions in their electricity demand forecasts.
So less economic growth means less demand for electricity. Are there particular industries in the EU that are being hit harder by this?
The report specifically highlights some challenges for energy-intensive industries in the EU. You know, those industries that use a lot of energy in their production processes. They're facing weaker demand for their products globally, and there's increasing competition from other countries, especially when it comes to exports. And then on top of that, they've got to deal with high energy prices, which puts them at a disadvantage compared to their competitors in places like the US and China.
Yeah, competing globally with those kinds of energy costs hanging over your head has got to be tough. Specifically, what industries are we talking about here?
The steel industry is a big one. Even though they saw a slight recovery in 2024, production is still pretty much where it was in 2020 after 2 years of going down. And there have been some high-profile plant closures and production issues for some major European steel companies. And then the chemical industry is another one facing challenges. They saw a small uptick in production, but overall confidence is low because of that weak global demand and those high energy prices. And this could actually end up delaying their plans to switch over to electricity and reduce their carbon footprint.
It's like a double whammy. They're facing lower demand for their products, and the energy they need to make those products is more expensive. Just how much higher are energy prices for industries in the EU compared to other major economies?
The numbers are pretty stark. Even though prices did go down a bit in 2023, the average electricity prices for energy-intensive industries in the EU were still about 65% higher in 2024 than they were back in 2019. And compared to their competitors in the US and China, they're really feeling the pain. On average, electricity prices in the EU are double what they are in the US and about 50% higher than in China.
Ouch. That's a tough position to be in.
Yeah.
Are EU governments doing anything to help these industries cope with these high energy costs?
They are. Because these high energy prices seem to be sticking around, the European Commission and individual EU countries have been looking at ways to offer some financial support to these industries. One of the main mechanisms is the EU Emissions Trading System, or EU ETS compensation scheme. The EU ETS puts a price on carbon emissions from industries, but this compensation is meant to offset some of the higher electricity costs that these energy-intensive industries might face.
So it's kind of like a way to cushion the blow of those higher energy prices.
Exactly. And we've seen countries like Germany, Spain, and Italy making changes to their compensation schemes to provide more support to their industries. For example, Germany changed its rules so that companies can get 100% compensation for what are called indirect emission costs between 2023 and 2030.
So some relief is being offered. But what about policies aimed at getting households to switch to electricity? for things like heating and driving, like subsidies for electric vehicles. Are those having a noticeable impact on electricity demand in the EU?
Those national policies definitely make a difference in how many electric vehicles people buy. When countries roll back those incentives, it has a direct impact. For example, when Germany ended its environmental bonus for electric vehicle purchases at the end of 2023, there was a pretty big drop in the number of electric vehicles registered in 2024. France saw a similar trend when they made changes to their subsidy scheme. But on the other hand, countries that kept or even strengthened their EV incentives, like Belgium, saw a surge in sales because their policies made it more attractive to buy an electric car.
It's really interesting how much these government policies can shape consumer choices and ultimately impact electricity demand. One final point on the EU. The report touched on how taxes and fees on electricity compared to natural gas could be a roadblock to getting more people to switch to electricity. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
It's a really important issue as the EU tries to electrify more things to meet its climate goals. Basically, households in the EU end up paying way more in taxes, fees, and all those extra charges for electricity than they do for the same amount of energy from natural gas. On average, across the EU, electricity was about 130% more expensive in the first half of 2024 when you factor in all those charges. And while part of that is just because the overall price of electricity is higher, even if you look specifically at those non-VA taxes and charges, it's still way more expensive in many countries. Denmark and Italy had some of the biggest price gaps between electricity and gas, while places like the Netherlands and Austria actually had lower non-VA charges on electricity.
So the way different countries tax and charge for energy can actually discourage people from switching to electricity, even if those electric options are more energy efficient in the long run. That's definitely something to think about. Now, let's turn our attention to where all this electricity is coming from. The report suggests that renewable energy is taking the lead in terms of new capacity being added.
Without a doubt, we're seeing this global boom in solar power, specifically solar photovoltaic or PV generation, and it's happening really fast. In the European Union, the amount of electricity generated from solar PV actually surpassed coal-fired power for the first time in 2024, reaching over 10% of their total electricity generation. And the IEA is forecasting that other major economies like China, the US, and India are all on track to hit that 10% mark for solar PV sometime between 2025 and 2027.
That's incredible growth for solar. What's the outlook specifically for the EU in terms of their overall renewable energy generation in the next few years?
The IEA's projections for the EU are pretty impressive. They're saying that renewable energy generation in the EU will increase by an average of 7% every year from 2025 to 2027. And by 2027, renewables will be providing a whopping 56% of all the electricity generated in the EU. This growth in wind and solar is expected to more than offset the decline in fossil fuel generation, with coal power projected to drop by an average of 11% per year and gas-fired power by about 6% per year over that same period.
That's a massive shift towards cleaner sources. But I can't help but think, with so much reliance on wind and solar, both of which depend on the weather, are there growing concerns about keeping the lights on? Can we rely on these intermittent sources?
That's the million-dollar question. And the IEA report actually delves into that, discussing something called Dunkelflaut events.
Dunkelflaut, that sounds ominous. What is that exactly?
It's a German word that basically means dark doldrums. And in the context of electricity, it refers to those times when both wind and solar power output are really low. It's like when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And these events can be a real challenge for power systems, especially if they happen when demand for electricity is high, like on a cold winter evening or a scorching summer afternoon.
So you've got low supply and high demand that's a recipe for potential blackouts. And I remember the report highlighting some recent examples of these Dunkelflaut events in Northern Europe.
Yeah, back in November and December of 2024, Northern Europe experienced some pretty significant Dunkelflaut events. Wind and solar generation were both way below their usual levels, and as a result, the wholesale prices for electricity spiked in Germany and some of the Nordic countries.
How high did those prices get?
Well, on December 12th, for example, prices in Germany briefly went above 900 euros per megawatt hour. To put that in perspective, a megawatt hour is enough electricity to power about 1,000 homes for an hour.
So these Dunkelflaut events are like real-world stress tests for the electricity system. How did the system cope? Were there any major blackouts?
Surprisingly, no. Despite those price spikes, Northern Europe didn't experience any major blackouts during these events. And that's because the electricity markets in that region are really well connected. They can share power across borders, and they also had enough traditional power plants that could be ramped up to fill the gap when wind and solar weren't producing much. But it's worth noting that Europe has been retiring some of its more flexible power plants in recent years, mostly those that burn coal and lignite. So the situation could be different in the future if they don't have enough backup generation.
So they dodged a bullet this time. But it's a reminder that having those traditional power sources, as well as other ways to balance the grid, like energy storage, is crucial when you're relying more and more on renewables. What about those price spikes? Even if they were temporary, they must have had some impact, right?
You would think so, but surprisingly, the impact of those price spikes on the average price of electricity over the entire period wasn't that big. The report also talks about this idea of scarcity pricing, where the price of electricity goes up a lot when the available supply gets really tight. And it suggests that some industries might actually be helping to mitigate those price spikes by being flexible with their electricity use.
So they're basically reducing their electricity consumption when prices are really high.
Exactly. For some energy-intensive industries, it might actually be cheaper for them to just temporarily shut down their operations than to pay those crazy high electricity prices.
So it's like an unintentional form of demand response where high prices encourage some consumers to reduce their energy use.
That's fascinating. What about other parts of the world? Have there been any similar periods of low wind and solar output? The report mentions a wind drought that happened in the U.S. Pacific Northwest in January 2024. They had a really cold snap, and the wind just stopped blowing, so their wind turbines weren't producing much electricity. They actually had three separate wind drought events, each lasting for several hours.
And how do they handle that?
In that case, they were able to rely on hydropower. They can control how much water flows through their dams, so hydropower is really flexible and can quickly ramp up generation when needed. It was really instrumental in preventing any major problems.
So hydropower came to the rescue. That's a good reminder of the value of having a diverse mix of electricity sources. But what about longer-term periods of low wind and solar output? Has there been any research on what might happen if both sources underperform for days or even weeks?
Yeah, there's some interesting research out there that the report highlights. One study looked at historical periods where both wind and solar energy production were really low across the U.S., and they found that these combined low output events, which they call energy droughts, could actually last for up to 6 days. And they found that Texas tended to have the longest energy droughts on an hourly basis, while California had the longest ones on a daily basis.
6 days without much wind or solar power. That's a long time. Are grid operators taking this into account as they plan for the future?
They definitely should be. And NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, has actually highlighted this research and stressed how important it is to consider these potential energy droughts when planning for future electricity needs and figuring out how much storage they might need.
So we can't just focus on managing those short-term fluctuations. We need to be prepared for those longer stretches without much wind or solar power. What are some of the options for dealing with these longer VRE droughts?
The IEA report emphasizes two key things. First, we need to make sure we have enough dispatchable capacity. That means power plants that can be turned on and off quickly and reliably when we need them. And second, we need to develop and deploy more long-duration energy storage technologies.
So it's like a 1-2 punch, flexible power plants and big batteries.
Yeah.
What are some examples of those long-duration storage technologies?
Well, for those shorter periods of low renewable output, maybe a few days to a couple of weeks, pumped hydro storage is a proven technology. It's basically using electricity to pump water uphill to a reservoir and then releasing that water to generate electricity when you need it.
Like a giant water battery. What about for those really long stretches, weeks or even months?
For those longer time frames, there are some promising technologies in development. Things like thermal energy storage, which involves storing heat, and hydrogen storage, where you use excess electricity to produce hydrogen, which can then be burned later to generate power or used for other purposes. These are seen as potential solutions for storing energy from one season to the next.
So it sounds like a combination of flexible power plants and a variety of energy storage technologies will be essential for keeping the grid reliable as we rely more and more on wind and solar power. Now let's shift gears and talk about the cost of all this electricity. Wholesale electricity prices have been pretty volatile lately. What's the overall trend that the IEA is seeing?
In both the US and the EU, we've generally seen wholesale electricity prices decrease in the more recent period. But it's important to note that prices in the EU are still significantly higher than they were before the pandemic. And within Europe, the Nordic region, which has a lot of hydropower, had the lowest average wholesale prices in 2024.
Lower prices, that's good news for consumers, right?
Right.
But then there's this whole weird thing about negative electricity prices. It still boggles my mind that the price of electricity can actually go below zero. Can you help us understand why that happens?
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But negative wholesale electricity prices happen when the supply of electricity is so much greater than the demand that some power producers are actually willing to pay to have their excess electricity taken off the grid. It's like they're saying, please take this electricity off my hands, I'll even pay you to do it.
But why would they do that? Wouldn't it make more sense to just shut down their power plants?
Sometimes it's not that simple. There are a few key things that can lead to these negative prices. One big factor is the increasing amount of renewable energy on the grid, particularly wind and solar power. Once the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, those power sources have very low operating costs. So it makes sense for them to keep generating electricity even if the price is really low, or even negative because they're not spending much on fuel.
So it's like a sunk cost for them. They've already invested in the wind turbines or solar panels, so they might as well keep them running even if they're not making much money or even losing a little bit.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of inflexibility with some of the traditional power plants. Some power plants, like nuclear plants or some coal-fired plants, can't be easily turned on and off or ramped up and down quickly. They're designed to operate at a fairly steady output. So if demand suddenly drops, they might find themselves with more electricity than the grid can handle, and they might have to accept a negative price just to avoid having to shut down completely, which can be costly and disruptive.
So it's a combination of having a lot of renewable energy that's essentially free to produce once it's installed, and then having some power plants that are just not very nimble when it comes to adjusting their output.
Exactly. And then on top of that, there are all sorts of regulations and market rules that can contribute to these negative prices. For example, some countries have policies that guarantee renewable energy producers a certain price for their electricity, regardless of what's happening in the market. So even if the market price goes negative, they're still getting paid that guaranteed price. And that can create situations where it makes sense for them to keep generating, even if they're losing money on each unit of electricity they sell.
It's fascinating how these market dynamics play out. The report also mentions that negative